One of the most important but little-known concepts of Western occultism is that of the egregore, an autonomous psychic entity created by a collective group mind. An egregore is sustained by belief, ritual, and sacrifice, and relies upon the devotion of a group of people, from a small coven to an entire nation, for its existence. An egregore that receives enough sustenance can take on a life of its own, becoming an independent deity with powers its believers can use to further their own spiritual advancement and material desires. Presenting the first book devoted to the study of egregores, Mark Stavish examines the history of egregores from ancient times to present day with detailed and documented examples, and explores how they are created, sustained, directed, and destroyed. Stavish's book is a thought-provoking examination of the subject with well-researched historical evidence. It's a long overdue analysis, and if you're interested in Western esotericism, it's a must-read. Stavish's work is interesting and timely, and I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to discuss it at length with him. Mark Stavish, I want to welcome you to Occult of Personality podcast. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Oh, thank you very much for the invitation. It is great to be here.
Today, the main topic of our conversation is your book, Egregores, the Occult Entities That Watch Over Human Destiny, published by Inner Traditions. Really thought-provoking book that you put together here, and I appreciate it very much. I'm just curious, before we begin talking about it specifically, what prompted you to write about this subject?
Well, several things, and often it's the things we don't think are that critical. But it was an idea, and I was having lunch with Jocelyn Godwin in Binghamton, New York, and I just mentioned to him off the cuff. I said, I'm thinking about writing a monograph on egregores because there really is nothing out there. And he just said, well, thank God, because if you don't do it, I'm going to have to. So I went home and took my notes, put them together, say Howard even research on it, and then began writing the book. Like Baby Bear's Porridge, when it was done, it was late. So that is how the book came to be. Excellent. It was wonderful writing, too, by the way, because it's different from other books that I've written. For those of you who've read some of my other stuff, this book, and I don't say this lightly, really wrote itself because it's a very conversational tone. I tend to write conversationally, but this really just did come across as a conversation between two people as you read it. So it's really nice to read. It flows very freely. We didn't even have chapter markings with the finished manuscript. We kind of had to figure out where to put those in. Oh, here's a good place for a chapter, and here's a good one, because it just flowed.
It's a comfortable read, but it also made me think, and I had to stop at times and just consider what you were saying and think about it a little bit, which I really liked a lot.
I'm glad to hear that, because everyone is saying that who's interviewed me. And the notion of the egregore, or the egregore, however we want to pronounce it, because it is a potato question, nobody gets it right, is something that we have all been exposed to. And yet, like the invisible demon that needs to be brought forth during the exorcism to be gotten rid of, we don't have a name for it. And then when someone reads the book and they have a name, they say, oh, that's it. That's what I was experiencing. That's what I was involved in. And there's a lot of aha moments for folks when they read it.
Would you be so kind as to define the term egregore for our listeners who maybe haven't read the book yet, just so they have a better sense of what we're speaking about?
It's really very simple. It is a collective entity, and everyone has been familiar with this. Everyone has been exposed to it. And what it does is it functions as a social control mechanism. And that's a phrase that you should really begin to understand. Just think about it. Social control mechanism. So egregores control how we behave in social settings. Those settings tend to be specific. So anytime you get together with your family, and there's certain ways you may behave. Or when you get together in your lodge, or in your circle, or in your church, or a political group, or the Parent-Teachers Association, they have certain egregores, or group ethos, if you will, a group sense. Now, it's important because there's two aspects to an egregore. There is one which is just spontaneous, which whenever a group of people get together and kind of there's a leveling factor, or there's those which are consciously and actively created. And the book tends to address those more often, but they both have a function. Now, the difference is in the first kind that we've talked about, just a kind of general collective unconscious or corporate ethos, okay, if you will. Corporate culture is a phrase we hear a lot. Whenever you have those things, they kind of happen often spontaneously or give the appearance of it. They take place over time. However, in the traditional sense of an egregore, there's actually a purpose to it. Not that they don't have it, they have a purpose, but there's a very specific esoteric purpose in that there are spiritual entities attached to or part of this collective awareness that people in terra firma may not necessarily know of or be aware of.
Thank you. I'm curious, in terms of the spiritual entities, or when you have an egregore that's connected with, say, a major religion, could you compare or contrast that with the concept of divinity?
I believe that there is a bit of hair splitting that goes on, and that's discussed in the book.
Mm-hmm.
That is, does the egregore of the Franciscans, do the Franciscans even have an egregore? And one of the authors of Meditations on the Tarot says, no, they don't, because it works through a human person of St. Francis. Is Christianity an egregore? Because they say no, because it works through the person of Jesus Christ, which is, second person of the Trinity. I believe that is very nice theologically, but I don't believe it is accurate. I think that if we look at any group that we're involved with, we can recognize that there are certain collective patterns of both implicit and explicit thought and behavior. And that therefore there is an egregore present of some kind.
Thank you. Now, you begin your book in the first chapter discussing Tibetan Buddhism, and I'm just wondering if you might speak a bit about why you started the book talking about egregores that many of your readers may not be as familiar with.
Well, that's just to annoy my Buddhist convert friends. They tend to be wonderfully uppity. So, really they do. So I wanted to point out to them, I said, you guys, you just move from one egregore to another, from being a non-practicing Jew or a non-practicing Catholic, hence the term Jubu, and go and reject all of the conservatism of those religions to go to an equally medieval and conservative religion known as Tibetan Buddhism. And then once the shock wears off and they can breathe again, it's the question of what's going on there. And Buddhism has very strong social control mechanisms, and you see it particularly in the convert community. And it's very powerful. Now, again, is this good or ill? Well, that depends on the individual, but it is there. And since most people are familiar with the notions of Alexandra David Neal and her discussion of the Tulpa and the Tulku, magical creations and projections, I thought that was a good place to start, both for the traditional occultist, but also for people who are familiar with Buddhism. I think Alexander David Neal gets a bad rap, so do a few others. They were there back in the day. So it's always interesting when stuff comes out about Blavatsky, that they find out later was true, that these scholars had dismissed in their snobbishness. But I feel the same about her. I thought she was a good pick.
Yeah, there's no substitute for being there and doing it yourself.
Right, and this thought form is something that is the key to much of her longevity of her writing. This notion that she has created this thought form, this tulpa, and that is the basis of all magic and all occultism everywhere. That the mind can affect energy, and that energy can coalesce into matter. And then the question comes in: where does consciousness play a part? And do these things become semi-autonomous or self-aware? It's an early form of, if you want to call it artificial intelligence, what we're looking at. I mean, most modern occultists, even some of the folks that I've talked to who've written extensively, are quite naive about the notion of thoughts.
That's interesting.
And the role of actually understanding their own mind, because they tend to limit magic to this thing that they can, as if it's only ceremonial or something of that nature.
That's fascinating. I mean, if it doesn't have the power to transform the mind or to recognize itself, then what's going on?
Well, and we have to ask ourselves, if our thoughts are things, or the potential to become a corporeal thing of some kind, density, if we're looking at a spectrum here. Just as we are speaking, there's a small graph going across my screen that shows the lines of the conversation. Some are bigger than others, some are farther apart. And, our thoughts are like that too. So how do our thoughts then affect not only perception, which is really the realm of psychology, how do they affect experience in terms of physiology, so we have health, but then how do they affect the physical world around us? And that is an area that I've seen many modern magicians abandon because they have not had the ability to make any change in the physical world. And I believe that the reason for that is because of the amount of mental discipline that's required in terms of self-awareness.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, when you look at some of the Vajrayana, which is really a survival Asiatic shamanism, and you look at magical Taoism, and you look at a lot of the Indian yogas and tantras, and it all starts with this kind of notion of my thoughts are real. There's a lot of areas we can go into here that would be humorous and politically incorrect, but at the same time, that's the fundamental notion. So if I have a thought, this is the key. All egregores are thought forms, but not all thought forms are egregores.
What really argues, I think, or I could make an argument based on what you're saying, that it's crucial to discipline and purify the mind in order that the thoughts don't become harmful to yourself and others.
Well, yes, and I talked about that 10 years ago when I wrote Kabbalah for Health and Wellness, and it was kind of just blown over by some people, and others thought, wow, what a groundbreaking statement, because if you look at the contemporary occult community, it doesn't believe that any kind of purification is necessary whatsoever. And then they wonder why so many of them are neurotic and physical wrecks.
Another good point.
And we get into that in the book later when we talk about the harmful effects of egregores. Some of them were quite physically and psychologically and spiritually tragic. And we give those because they are extreme. And that's the point, they are extreme. But, I talk to folks who are extensively involved in various forms of demonology and exorcism, and almost all of them come to a terrible end. Very few of them end their lives well. And that needs to be paid attention to. Because they don't have good psychic hygiene.
That's an important point, yeah.
Well, while we're getting off the point a little bit, back to the notion of the egregore, since it's a collective entity, then the question is, your mother was right. Pick your friends because you become like the company you keep. And historically speaking, there's some jokes about, a group of yogis should never be more than half a dozen. Magical circles, the old Rose Croix the magic number was 9. There are only 9 people in each circle. And the important point here is that you become like the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Right.
It's just that simple. And that's, again, what is that? Is that intentional? With most people, no, it's not intentional because they don't really intentionally pick their friends well.
That's right.
I have people all the time asking me, young guys, say, "Oh man, Mark, my life's a disaster. Blah blah blah. What can I do? I need to make some money. I need to change my life. What can I do?" And I look at them and I said, "Where do you live?" And I said, "Turn on your computer, go online right now." Okay. I said, "What I want you to do is I want you to find the wealthiest area code where you live in your area. You have them? Good. Now what I want you to do is I want you to find the nearest Rotary Club and go join it." I've got 2 heads. I said, "Well, who's at that club? None of your lodge mates.
That's right.
They're in Bicycle Messenger Lodge number 1, Manhattan.
Mm.
You know, they said, you have to go be where the people are who have money and know how to make it.
It's an excellent point. I wonder if we could go back to your discussion of Tibetan Buddhism, because you discuss what they might call a deity, but is known as Dorje Shugden. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit.
Sure. And just to backtrack a little bit, you know, in the discussion that is reported by Alexandra David Neal with her with the Lama, he says, you know, just because we don't believe in lions doesn't mean they're not out there.
That's right.
And we have to be careful not only of the lions we create, but the lions created by others.
Absolutely.
Now, Dorje Shugden is an interesting character because there's a great deal of controversy within Tibetan Buddhism over it, specifically within the Gelugpa sect. Most people don't know it, but the Dalai Lama is only the head of the Gelugpa order. He is not the head of all Tibetan Buddhism. And there is considerable, even up until before the Chinese invasion, the Gelugpa were quite adamant about stomping out other Buddhist sects, particularly the Nyingma. And that meant through violence.
That's right. Conversion or death.
And many people, particularly converts in the West, don't want to know that, and that's a reality.
Mm-hmm.
So within these different sects, they have protector deities, and these protector deities are made up of usually two kinds of things. One is a being of some kind, usually an earthbound god, which is really similar to a demon, or an elemental, but a demon really that is bound by oath bound to do a certain thing or protect a certain place, and that usually is justified under protecting under the Dharma. Now, another thing is human beings can be brought into this service as well. And Dorje Shugden is believed to be a prisoner who is executed and brought to this process of deification. This should not be unfamiliar to some of your listeners who are familiar with some of the darker things. That is not an unusual statement. Okay? So the energy, the consciousness can be earthbound, if you will, or bounded in some astral fashion to act as a conduit between the visible and the invisible realms. And Dorje Shugden is his protector deity that the Dalai Lama had practiced in his youth. He has since rejected it and urged other Buddhists not to practice it. And one of the reasons is that when they say a protector deity, they mean not only a protector of the Gelugpa sect, but that means all sects outside the Gelugpa, up until really they had to get along. When they finally had to play nice after the Chinese invaded, that meant any enemies of the Dharma, which basically meant everybody else, you know, in reality. So there you have it. And Dorje Shugden is a very controversial figure. But we see the same notion of formation of those beings. I mean, what do we have with Jesus but a crucified or murdered, criminal? We have two thieves murdered with him, crucified along with him, that are brought into the egregore for the formation of the spiritual conduit. We see that all throughout various, third world practices, primitive practices, and not much more because it's basically the same thing. It has to do with the nature of energy, consciousness, and blood, and how all these things interact.
That brings me to an interesting point that you made in the book. You talk about these egregores basically attracting sympathetic souls for the purpose of vampirizing them. Sure.
What you have is, again, everything in here is energetic. So, like attracts like. That's what you feed upon. I mean, we have dinner, we eat, we excrete, we reproduce. Why do we think that these energetic beings don't as well on some level? And, when people go to certain stores, they just like it there. They feel good there. They're not going to buy anything often, but they like it. They may go to a certain restaurant and feel the same way. They just want to have a drink or sit with friends. They like the view. Everything is very uplifting. Same thing with other people that they go to, or certain clubs or certain events. Okay? Well, the reverse is true as well. I mean, if If you're going at a strip club, I mean, what's going to be there? If you're going to a bar, what do you expect to find? I mean, there's going to be energetic parasites there. And then there's variations along the way, of course. Same thing with neighborhoods. I mean, this blends over into another topic that we often get dragged into, and that's the discussion of, demonology, obsession, possession. But, you really, cleanliness really is next to godliness. I mean, there is something to be said for the notion of, feng shui, air and water, the energies of life, okay, how they move. And, you can get a pretty good idea what locations, which houses, which areas in the neighborhood are going to be prone to, we'll say, parasitical problems, to be polite, just by looking at them. Like attracts like.
You brought this up earlier, the idea that major religions essentially are promulgating egregores, even though it might be under the guise of divinity or deity, which puts religious people in a bit of a bind in terms of freeing themselves from this sort of situation, it would appear.
Well, everybody's in the same bind, whether they're religious or not, because, again, I've seen people in this bind with occult groups, with political movements. Probably the most damaging and prominent egregore we have right now, the most dangerous one, is political correctness. It's insidious and everywhere. Try and get people to disengage from that. Think for themselves. See the obvious. So it's no different. The idea is a conforming mechanism, for better or worse. And sometimes it's good. Sometimes these conforming mechanisms are helpful to us. Okay? Such as, learning how to appropriately behave in public. When you're seated at a restaurant. Learning how to be polite. There are learning how to sit in class and learn, or how to share. Now, there's a lot of good conforming mechanisms that we have up there. And I don't want that message to be lost, because there are helpful and healthy egregores. You know that I know a lot of people who are involved with the great egregore known as their local gym.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they just, oh man, I got to go to the gym. And then once they get in there, it's like bam, bam, bam. The juices are flowing, things are happening. Okay? We can look at certain aspects of, AANA, helping people pull away from addiction through the power of that group conformity. So there are good aspects, I want that to be clear. But often what we see is the most insidious ones tend to be, at some point, something that's gone toxic, regardless of whether it's a religion or political philosophy, which are the two big ones that you run into. Religion and political philosophy are the two biggest egregores. Or groups, I should.
Now, when I used to be more active on Facebook, I would notice that you were rather outspoken in terms of political correctness and trendy social ideas. And I'm just curious if you have any advice for people involved in the occult or esoteric who have adopted those ideas or feel some sort of what you might call like social or political crusading that they seem to marry with their esoteric beliefs.
Oh yeah, you're on that's the path to perdition right there, literally and figuratively, because those who can do, those who can't become social activists, and you see that within all religions and metaphysical groups, particularly. In the beginning, it's about individual awakening, okay, and it's about method and practice. And when that no longer works, then it's about some kind of group think or group identity. Okay, I am this, I am that. And there's a certain buzz that comes from being part of the group because of the juices that flow. And then when that no longer works, you just kind of degenerate on to some variation of the Unitarian Universalists, and you're just a political action committee under the guise of religion or metaphysics and spirituality. And so, you can, because you only bring to the world what you are. Now, you only remake it in your own image. You're not going to make it better. And in fact, the world doesn't really need to be better. The world can't be fixed. Only people can change themselves. So this whole notion of politicizing occultism and politicizing these movements and witch hunts that go on, like in the OTO and other groups that I hear about, these are just an excuse for not actually having done the work themselves and being failures at it. And that's really what it is. So if you want to be serious about your work, you have to have a daily practice, a good practice. You have to be disengaged from a lot of these threads that pull you in different directions. And you have to get together with a small group of people who don't necessarily think all as you do on all things, but who are dedicated to their practice as well and whom you can help in those areas. But, there's no such thing as a cosmic politics. And, I took Christian Bernard to task for that. Some of your listeners may know he's the imperator of the Rosicrucian Order Amor.
Mm-hmm.
His father was Raymond. And Christian took over maybe in the early 90s. He's been there for about 30 years. And last spring, I guess, or in April, May, or something like that, March, I got a copy of an article that he had written called Cosmic Politics. And there's no such thing. These are all just human ideas projected onto the universe. The universe is only concerned with the hierarchy, and that hierarchy is power. And that power at each level implies a direct information and awareness as well. So it's not blind power, it's intelligent power. So knowledge and gnosis and power are synonymous. They're one and the same on that level. And if you don't get that, then you don't understand that there's really nothing that you can affect in the physical world of any lasting means. But that power is only achieved individually. Now, some people will form groups and attempt to access it and attain it, but still the idea is through that egregore, they then achieve some level of that themselves. They get a piece of it, a piece of that cosmic pie, if you will, and that specialized energy, whether it be Venusian or Mercurial or Martial or solar, what have you, something like that. But that's a very personal experience too. So anything that is talking about universal reformation or change or salvation is a trap. It is an abuse of your goodwill and will only lead you to sorrow and suffering, because National Socialism and communism were both utopian ideas.
Do you see? I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was saying that is not understood by a lot of people. Those utopian ideals murdered, well over 100 million people collectively?
At least.
150?
Yeah. Do you see, it seems to me that there's many esoteric schools of thought that run along similar utopian lines. Rosicrucianism is probably the most obvious, but thankfully it's never gone to those extremes.
But even there, the Rosicrucianism and the utopianism there is open to serious question.
Mm-hmm.
Universal Reformation in 1605 has a whole different meaning than using those words in 2018. So the contextual nature of that people keep bringing up is always lost.
I'm curious why you think it is that so few people are willing to point out these things. Is it just social pressure, or they don't want to bother, or maybe most people actually think the opposite is true? Do you have any sense of that in terms of the political correctness in the occult community?
Well, because it takes real effort to think about these things and to walk around them. It takes different kinds of life experience that you don't often acquire until time. One of the great problems is, we have 20-year-olds and 25-year-olds writing books on occultism, 30-year-olds.
Excuse my laughter, but it feels like anybody under the age of 35 doesn't really have enough life experience to be doing much of that.
No, they don't. You traditionally couldn't study Kabbalah until you were 40, and that meant you're near dead. And that's because all your obligations were taken care of at that point, and you could free yourself up a little bit to do it. This is an important issue. The other thing is we've taken the liminal and pushed it to the mainstream. We're into the center square, which is inherent. I mean, magic is inherently destabilizing. People don't grasp that. The whole purpose of a magical ritual is to destabilize something so that you can recreate something else. And because if you were happy with the way things work, you wouldn't be doing the ritual. So there'd be nothing to be, you're not going to do a ritual to keep things as they are. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of obvious stuff here that gets passed over in the rush for the experience. And a lot of folks just, they don't want to upset, their fans. I mean, this is the bloody battle for status as a personality, as a celebrity. That's really what this is all about. And don't anyone listening think otherwise. We're constantly doing a dog and pony show to get and hold your attention, and then maybe teach you something worthwhile before you flutter off to the next thing. But most of the time it's spent just trying to keep you happy enough so that you'll pay attention and maybe learn what we're trying to teach you so you don't screw up your life even worse. I mean, that's what really goes on in serious teaching these days. But that's because of the cultural egregore of personality, the notion of celebrity status. So most of these occult authors, even if they believe otherwise, they're not going to rock the boat because it's not good for sales, and sales aren't that great anyhow. So you don't want to ruin what you got.
Well, I appreciate you exposing the dark underbelly of the occult.
Well, I offered 2 years ago. I remember when we talked, and actually I had a book put together on it, the outline that several publishers looked at, and when they talked about it with me, it was, don't want to say no, but no. This isn't good for sales.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, several years ago, I certainly wouldn't have wanted to hear it or agreed with it or entertained the notion, but now it's in my face and there's no way to ignore it anymore.
Well, that's when people begin to wake up. And I think that means that most people are not self-aware enough internally to recognize what's going on. What they need is enough external stimulation to do that for them. I mean, that's what you're talking about. That only when they are bombarded so much by this groupthink and mind control that they finally take attention to this book, Egregores. I'm sure if I put this out 8 years ago, 10 years ago, it would not be getting the attention it's getting now.
That's very true, I think. It's interesting how circumstances coalesce to bring these things about, and attention focuses the attention a lot more. One thing I was wondering about is in the book you talk about the way the egregore is conveyed or promoted, that it does it through certain people. It's not just, you write, it's not just one person who's being distracted from the search for inner spiritual awakening or truth. No, it is everyone who reads or comes into a contact with a book of such banalities. And that's what it seems like you're talking about in terms of the teachers and the authors and the publishers and what is going on the internet.
That's exactly it. Colin Wilson, who all of your listeners should be familiar with, and if they're not, they should go read a good 2 or 3 dozen of his books. He wrote a book called The Mind Parasite. And a variation of this was picked up by Gary Lockman in a book that he wrote. The title escapes me at the moment. But in The Mind Parasites, which was an interesting book because it's a novel, and Colin Wilson was saying how he was talking to the administrator of the Lovecraft estate, who was also Lovecraft's publisher. And this is sometime, I guess, in the 60s or early 70s. And of course, Lovecraft had been dead for, 30 years or so. But his friend was still alive. And he said to him, well, he didn't think that Lovecraft was that great of a novelist. And he turned to Wilson and said, well, why don't you write a novel yourself? And Wilson, of course, being wonderfully honest, said, well, he had a point. So I did. And one of the novels he wrote was this book called Mind Parasites. which is not a terribly good novel, and he laughs about that. It's not terribly good. But the point is what matters. And this is where egregores come in. People think about evil in terms of this great control mechanism, meaning where they have to control you. Well, it's not about controlling you. It's about, as we see with political correctness, getting you to control or censor yourself, your own thoughts, your own actions. To get you to do it, that's the best. That's the ultimate. And to get you to do that, I don't need to influence everybody. I just need to influence the right person. Well, who's the right person? The right media personality. The person who has access to the greatest amount of minds through whatever medium they use, whether it's written word or broadcast or something.
Very true.
And that then spreads out, and people then get affected through that way. It's no different than any other form of advertising, except what's insidious here is that, there may be invisible beings on the other side of that are benefiting from your energetic outbursts, your energetic, your emotional those uncontrollable moments of emotional expression of rage and enthusiasm, or fill in the blank, whatever it happens to be that you see the media promote so much.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, no need for tanks in the streets when you've got this level of control.
Well, that's it. And something to think about is that back in the 40s, they knew that a single word gets a greater emotional response than a sentence, because a single word is it's decontextualized. That is, the person fills the context around it themselves. They supply the context. And that's the notion of Ericksonian hypnosis. There's a vagueness to it so that the person fills the context for the suggestion. So if you look at all of the titles on the bestseller list, you'll notice a lot of them are single words. And was it Woodward's recent book, Fear? Well, think about that. The title's called Fear.
Mm-hmm.
It immediately creates an endocrine response, even if only subtle.
Good point.
Now, when we take that and we move that into other areas, if you notice, most of the headlines that come up in your news feed are negative. Now, the mind does not know a negative. It creates a positive and then eradicates it very quickly. Okay? Because we have to think of something that isn't supposed to be there, even if it happens very quickly. Don't do this. There's that pause of, that, and then pull back.
Mm-hmm.
So when you see the headline, you say, things you didn't know. Well, that's like an insult. What do you mean I don't know that? See, there's an endocrine response to it, an adrenaline rush. It's a challenge. It's a threat. So most of these headlines are geared towards your, fight or flight mechanism. That's why people That's why they get so burned out so quickly on media exposure. Whereas if you were to create a positive line, a positive statement, the effect would be very different. It would be a different hormonal response.
Reminds me of those bumper stickers that just say resist.
Yeah, resist what?
Exactly.
What?
Mm-hmm. Now, in the book, you also write about extracting yourself or withdrawing from the power of an egregore can cause a backlash, and sometimes it may be better to sort of take refuge in a different egregore temporarily while you do that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, it's like anything. You need to do a slow withdrawal, because these things are not just ideas. They're an abstraction, but they're ideas that permeate your life. They permeate your nervous system. They permeate your physiology in that regard. Your whole life gets built around it. And I don't know if you've been in occult groups or esoteric groups of any kind, that when they fall or when they splinter, schism. Wow. It is brutal.
Right.
A lot of this stuff going on in the Catholic Church right now is, an example of that. Because betrayal of one's goodwill, the betrayal of one's idealism, either real or imagined, is perceived as so dramatic that, again, it's a fight or flight mechanism. And also, if you spend 20 years in a group or 10 years, you have friends. I mean, many people have given up things. They've sacrificed for these ideals. This isn't just like, joining, a knitting club.
Right.
That's what the political and religious or spiritual, philosophical are the most damaging and the most prominent in this activity of egregores, because they have the most emotional strength on us.
Mm-hmm.
Leaving your Civil War reenactment group is probably not going to be that traumatic. You'll miss it, you'll sell your stuff, and you'll go on and maybe go visit with your friends, but it's not going to be the same as leaving an esoteric lodge or a church. I mean, I had a fellow at my house today. He's a technician, and he was telling me about what had happened to him and his family when they went out with the church and sold everything they had, and things didn't work out. And the betrayal was palpable, and I understood.
It's brutal.
It was brutal, and I talked to him a bit, even though I could see he was a little confused by some of the artwork on my walls, but still, I want to help this guy because it's palpable. So you have to move from one egregore to another, just from one safe house to another, from a shelter to another. One that's less demanding, but still offers some sense of identity and protection, if you will. I don't like the word protection, it's more like a sense of identity.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's social supports, it's a social control mechanism. So you take those away, the supports are gone, people collapse. So people need social supports when they go through withdrawal of any kind. And this is very much like an addiction. It's identical to it, really.
There's probably a fair number of people listening who are involved in Freemasonry, and I'm just curious if you might give your impressions of the egregore of Freemasonry.
Well, Masonry is benign. People talk about Masonry. I said, well, have you been to a lodge lately?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. Well, if you haven't, stop talking now. And if you haven't, but think you want to know what's going, go join. There's a lot of nonsense built around Freemasonry. Of course, Freemasonry is not a monolithic structure. It does have landmarks, but no one can agree on how many there are or exactly what they are. But as the one Supreme Court justice said, it's like pornography. It's hard to define, but I know when I see it. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing with regular Freemasonry, the landmarks. It's hard to define, but we know them when we see them. And that being said, Masonry has many variety of activities. So the collective groupthink that goes on often shifts from lodge to lodge. The groupthink that you'll find in a traditional observance lodge or Scottish Rite is going to be a little different than what you're going to see in your average Blue Lodge. The lodges very much reflect their communities, for better or worse.
Mm-hmm.
So, if anything, the egregore of Freemasonry as a whole is a positive one because of the intense and immense amount of charitable work that it does.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a member of Masonic Order, through the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. The Great Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania was once called. And also my son is in DeMolay, and I've seen wonderful things happen for the boys in DeMolay and for the Rainbow Girls in the way it helps them to grow and mature and develop skills that you're not going to find in many other youth organizations. So I cannot say, despite all of my complaints and crankiness about certain behaviors and patterns in lodge administration or attitudes, I cannot say enough good things about the movement as a whole.
I would agree with that. In your book, you write also about, at this point in time, a controversial writer, Julius Evola, and the way he discusses the term egregore or egregoroi to indicate a spiritual elite, not dissimilar from Illuminati, as you point out, although more as observers and less as influencers, maybe. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about your impressions of Evola and his ideas of spiritual illumination for the elite.
Well, spiritual illumination is only for the elite. You do it in and of and through and for yourself. I mean, it helps others along the way, that's true, and that's why it's very important to be kind and helpful and generous as best you can, but no one gets enlightened for you. If that were the case, then Jesus died on the cross and we're all saved. Buddha got an enlightenment and we're all enlightened too. There's no collective enlightenment. And that's where this collectivism that we see in many of the New Age circles and insidiously working its way in through the occult orders and groups and various other entities is so dangerous. Yes, someone can help you or they can jumpstart the process, but they can't do it for you. So enlightenment is always a nature of a spiritual elite. And you see that in Buddhism. The story goes, the Buddha got enlightened and he didn't want to teach anybody. He didn't think anybody could understand it.
You might argue that they don't.
Well, the second turning of the wheel, the Dharma, was when one of the gods came down and said, oh, please teach. And he said, okay, I'll finally teach. But you see throughout those systems, the Oriental systems, the whole notion that there's times when teachers simply don't teach.
True.
Because it's cyclic.
And what's your impression of the whole, you mentioned the second turning of the Mahayana concept of the Bodhisattva, the one who undertakes the path in terms of, trying to aid all sentient beings?
Well, on the most basic level, the Bodhisattva is the embodiment of bodhicitta. And we wonderfully, translate that as compassion, which for our, Western liberals who just love to flock to this, it's immediate compassion. I can't tell you how many lamas have said to me that, they have, Westerners have very little wisdom. And what they mean by that is they just do stupid things. And the way we exercise compassion is stupid. We think we can solve the world's hurt. People hurt for a reason. Part of it is they have to solve it for themselves. Now, people constantly ask me for help with various kinds of psychic problems, often very legitimate psychic attacks and obsessions and possessions. I can't tell you how many times people have been with these problems for 10, 15, 20 years before they ask for help. Now, I don't know if you were me. I think I'd be there within a couple of weeks saying, what's going on here? This has got to go away. But they love this stuff, and they'll suck it up for a lifetime. And then you still can't get them to stop it. Because there's a payoff. There's a payoff from the suffering. There's a payoff from the addiction. A payoff from the membership.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
we have to make that very clear, that our understanding of the Bodhisattva as this infinite being of compassion doesn't necessarily mean they're always nice.
No, there's certainly the idea of wrathful compassion, for sure.
Yeah, there's tough love.
Yep.
Well, it helps people wake up. Sometimes you need a slap to get woken up in the morning. I don't know if you've got kids, but I got two of them. Getting them up in the morning for school, there's a lot of shaking that goes on.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Come on. Now, I stress that because now we go into, then what is bodhicitta? We call bodhicitta compassion. And, of course, the bodhisattva is the one who's the embodiment of it. But that's on the most outer level. In truth, bodhicitta is a sexual essence. It's the alchemical transformation of the bodily essence, which are male and female. There is no third. There's no 12th. There's no 7th. Okay, so there is only male and female. Those essences are refined and transformed. And in and through them, the alchemical body or the rainbow or diamond body is created.
Yeah, I've been told that there's a lot of work, like physical work, intentional suffering, as Gurdjieff might put it, that goes into forging the alchemical body, because otherwise it can't hold anything. And it just is like trying to put the magical essence in a colander, and it just runs right out.
Yes, I mean, for those who are involved in Kabbalah, really the so-called initiation of Tiferet, or knowledge and conversation with the holy guardian angel, or whatever you want to call it, is just the beginning of being an adult. That just says, hey, you're 18 in the universe and maybe 21. You reach the age of emancipation in adulthood. But that doesn't mean you know how to do anything. It's not really until you're an Adeptus mind or Adeptus Major. The forces of Deborah, the forces of Mars, energy in action in the world. pentagram, energy and action in the world, which is action, which means it's inherently karmic, because karma and action the same, and means it's inherently destabilizing. So you only then, when you learn to handle that destabilization, of course, and you only learn that when you are a adeptus exemptus, okay, or balanced out with the forces of mercy and hesed, that's when you really got your game on. And we have a lot of people who don't understand that. There's wonderful experiences of the initiation of the knowledge and conversation, but that's just the beginning. That's like saying, oh, you've got your black belt now, for those who study martial arts.
I'm interested to see, and this is not something I don't think you've addressed in the book specifically, but we've talked about Buddhism, Kabbalah, Western esoteric traditions. There's not much discussion online or in popular circles about Gurdjieff and his ideas, because it seems like much of what he had to say is kind of congruent with what you're talking about.
Right, Gurdjieff. I don't know much about him. I do have quite a few books that were given to me, written by one of his students, I guess his chief disciple in England, which are quite interesting. From what I gathered, he understood that immortality, again, is not a gift. You earn it. You forge something that can withstand the forces of the naught, as he said. You must form a sense of self that can withstand the forces of the nothingness, of the oblivion. But that nothingness means of all potentiality. You must form a sense of self that can withstand the energies of all potentiality. That is the Vajrasattva in Buddhism. That's the Vajrasattva. And it's Samantabhadra too. But we experience it as Vajrasattva. So you have to realize that that's why I said there's no freebies here. There's help and there's gifts, but you have to do something with them. Like there's no guarantee that this occult knowledge is going to be around 5 years from now. That's it, in and through yourself. That's the key essence of all this teaching, is that these energies work in and through you. Whether it's a evocation of a demon, you still have to have the energies working in and through you. Invocation of some great angelic purpose, it still works in and through you. Anything else, positive thinking, whatever you want to call it, any of these things, part of an egregore, the energies are in and through you. So you have to make sure that you have purified yourself, meaning got rid of the obscurations, the pollutants, the misguided ideas, the false assumptions, those things which would inhibit or taint the flow of this energy, because the energy brings with it awareness. That's the thing. There's no such thing as just energy. The energy always carries with it a signature of intelligence that directs it. So people have bad experiences often, which we always say, well, that's a good sign. And sometimes they get too into it. They like it too much. But there's often when people begin certain experiences because there's the purification process. And they're not completely pure, by the way. I mean, it's like when you're taking a plunger to your sink or your toilet. There's a lot of corrosion in there, and all you're moving out is the really big stuff. But you haven't cleaned it out to the pipes. You haven't cleaned it out to the walls.
Right.
That takes effort.
Yeah, that takes time and effort for sure. And patience.
But Gurdjieff had it. You don't get this for free. You have to earn it and make it for yourself.
Now, some of the figures you write about in the book are somewhat lesser known in occult circles, not by everyone, but by a lot of people, such as Tom Borg and Mauni Sadhu and Paul Sadir, and Jean Dubuis. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of them and their work and your impressions of it, because you've really delved into it quite a bit.
Well, Tom Borg is, of course, the so-called anonymous author of Meditations on the Tarot, which is a book that Antoine Faivre referred to as probably one of the single greatest books on Western esotericism. It's often not well known that Faivre was a Martinist in his youth, as he said to me. And he and many others, names all of which you are member your listeners would recognize were present for a ritual I did in Italy, the Jupiter ritual, in fact, many years ago, which I told them there's no observers, only participants. Went quite well. And with that said, Tomborg, of course, is writing from the Catholic perspective, very much kind of a medieval Catholic perspective, which is wonderful. I do encourage your listeners to read the book and to get a hold of it, but it is, again, written from that particular view. So you have to kind of work with it a little bit if you're not familiar with, some of the Catholic theological notions. And the fact that you have a book on Hermeticism, Catholic Hermeticism using the tarot, and which is just a phenomenal book. And I think, what was the endorsement on the back? I don't have my copy handy, but it was by one of the leading Catholic theologians of the age, too, of the 20th century, with an endorsement for it.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't speak highly enough about that book. That's probably one of the best examples of real Hermetic instruction that I've ever read.
It is. It's a complete embodiment of the Martinist tradition. So without having to go through Martinist initiation, just read that book. Mm-hmm. The same thing with Sadhu's book, Muni Sadhu, his book on the tarot is basically Martinist teachings. But that said, then we have Paul Sadir, who was a member of the French occult revival. And of course, he was a Martinist, Rosicrucian, various groups. And he wrote a book called Initiation, which Gareth Knight translated into English. I think Gareth Knight even said he learned French just to translate the book into English. Because Muni Sadhu's version, I understand, and of course I haven't compared them side to side, but I understand that it was a good translation, but not as good. Possibly because, his native tongue was Polish. I think it was Polish. And then it was from Polish to, he learned English and then was translated into French. So, but either way, the notion of the egregore is firmly and strongly established in that book because it plays such a prominent role in the French occult circles. And then we have Jean Dubuis, who was the founder of the Philosophers of Nature, the French-American Alchemical Association, founded around 1978, closed its doors after 22 years in 2000. Its teachings are still available online. It's mineral alchemy, spagyrics, Kabbalah. Kabbalah is a wonderfully de-baroqued version of Golden Dawn rituals, but with a great deal more insight into the potential and possibilities, as well as applications for initiation, without all the heroic lodge trappings. So they're very good too. Those are available online. Dubuis was in various French groups, particularly Martinist and Rosicrucian. He probably should have been, as we say, the Grand Master of Amorc in France, but Bernard, of course, did, and I mentioned his son earlier, Christian Bernard, who later went on to become the imperator. Things would have been very different had we been there. He ran a Martinist Heptad or lodge in Paris that had, if I remember correctly, well, I'm hesitant now to say the number. I don't have it in front of me, but it was quite a large number. I think it was around 300 or 400 members. I want that to sink in. I mean, that is huge. And he was quite well respected for his knowledge. But he also insisted on separating from egregores. And that was really the first time I had encountered that notion that one should separate out. This is important to get apart from them. Because until that time, they were always spoken of as a good thing. You want to connect with this egregore. You want to be a part of it. It protects you. It's like this astral funnel or this astral, well, it's often more of an astral cocoon. But as he points out, and so do some other authors, when you read carefully, Sadhu wrote extensively about egregores, and of course so did Tomborg. That's why they're in the book. And they're all coming from that same French tradition. As you are putting your energy into something, you may be putting it for one reason, but the leadership may be using it for something else. Mm. Again, it's an abuse of your goodwill. So that's why they're mentioned.
Thank you. I'm curious of your opinion on Dubuis' book, The Experience of Eternity.
Well, I wrote I think a jacket blurb for it. I think I did. And his book, Experience of Eternity, is essentially a form of natural talismanic magic for initiatic purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And I had attended several conferences where he gave teachings on it, and I actually wrote an early article on it for The Stone, which was the journal that they put out at the time. I still have my original notes, and can still remember very clearly and precisely the experience when I had first undertaken it, as if it had happened just this morning.
Wonderful. And I'd like to spend just a few minutes, if you don't mind, talking about freeing oneself from the influence of egregores, because that, at the tail end of your book, you devote some considerable length to that subject, because, and ultimately, I think that, to be able to free oneself, you have to understand the egregore, which you very lucidly describe in the prior chapters. But for listeners, if you could maybe give them a taste of what's involved in freeing oneself from the influence of egregores, if they so choose to do that.
Well, first of all, you have to decide, do you want to? And you may be uncertain. You may like your involvement in the group, but you just want to, reel it back a little bit. You don't want it constantly taking up so much time or energy or attention. So the first thing you do is, and this can then help you decide if you want to leave completely. It doesn't matter what it is. This applies to any group. Whether it's a political group, Society for Creative Anachronism, Boy Scouts, your church, your magical lodge, what have you, is go into your room, your house, your apartment, and everything associated with that group, take it off the walls, put it in boxes, and put it in your closet. And leave it there for a month. Just for a month. Better if you can do about 40 days. That would be better. But a month is good. Now what happens is, as you notice as you do this, there's a literal and figurative space that opens up. Because without those pictures of you and your guru, or books, or CDs, or posters, or whatever you have, even the funky little keychain you might have, okay? Without that stuff constantly grabbing your attention and constantly reminding you of your association and allegiance, or duty, or whatever, however it's framed, suddenly your mind gets a little looser, but it also gets more anxious.
Mm.
And that anxiety is a good thing, because it means that now there is space. Well, nature abhors a vacuum, so you have to be careful and not fill that space in by running back to the egregore, to the group, or by filling it in with something else, say equally. Do something different with that space. Or just leave it as it is and appreciate it and enjoy it. And that's the first thing, is get a baseline of just how much pull this particular egregore, and there may be more than one, there may be two or three, has on you. You'd be surprised. You'd be surprised how. Now, that's why when you look at police states, it's everywhere. The reminder, the symbolism of the egregore is everywhere. And whether it's the picture of the leader, the dear leader, or whether it's the stamp, on the postage stamps or on the letterhead, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, you can't even pick up it's almost impossible to pick up a coffee cup, from the National Socialist period without seeing an eagle and swastika on it. It's impossible to pick up almost anything from the Soviet Union in that period and not see a hammer and sickle on it. Mm-hmm. I mean, I mean everything. I mean everything. Because all of those things are talismans. And it's the same thing with people in their groups. Their swamis, their lamas, their Crowleyites, whatever they happen to be.
Right.
You got to have their universal hexagram on everything they do.
It's true.
Yeah. Because now it's an identifier. It's not a means to an end. It's an end in and of itself. That means you're in a cult. Now,
Right.
it doesn't mean you joined a cult. It means you turned it into one for yourself. So you're the one who closed the prison door. You're the one who can open it.
That's true. These are all good points.
Thank you.
Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about the organization that you run, the Institute of Hermetic Studies, and what your mission is and what you've been doing for so many years.
Well, the Institute for Hermetic Studies, we just celebrated, I think, our 20th anniversary in May, and we run courses, seminars. We did for many years. A lot of those were found on YouTube. Someone vandalized our YouTube site, so we have to get things reloaded.
That's a shame.
And fortunately, almost everything has been transcribed and is available in published form. So the transcriptions are a little better. It's nice to hear the lessons, to hear them. That's really wonderful. And some of them are funny. There's some of the presentations are actually pretty funny. So they're worth just catching the first part just to watch that, the introductions. But almost everything has been transcribed. And we cover a lot of areas. Like we have one presentation, which became a monograph, of course, on obsession, possession, poltergeist, obsession, and possession. We have one called Pathology of the Sublime, which discusses a lot of the things that can go wrong on the spiritual journey, how to recognize them and how to correct them. And again, this stuff is intentionally to stabilize. So if you don't have someone there to help you, a good therapist, a good teacher, a good friend, a good group, you are entering into a problem area when you undertake occult practices, or any kind of spiritual or psycho-spiritual practice. Because you're trying to recreate, which means, to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs.
Mm-hmm.
So, the egg, or the hardness of our personality, our sense of self, is being restructured through these practices. Remember, the ultimate goal is to create a sense of self that can withstand the pressures of eternity, of the naught. That's a big order. So, we've done seminars and workshops. We've published quite a bit as a result of the last 4 years to get that out there and get it stable as best as it can and available to people. We don't have a lot of group work. Occasionally there'll be some things where we come together and do something, some of us. But that is not a mainstay, because we do not have an egregore, so to speak, that is connected to anything invisible per se. There's been no intention of creating that. I'm sure in general we are part of the Hermetic milieu, if you want, and the hand of Hermes is probably over our heads in some way. However, beyond that, there's nothing particular. We don't claim access to the secret chiefs on a regular basis or anything like that. So it's to make information as clear, as precise, accessible, and usable as possible. That is our mission. And we have a conference annually in northeastern Pennsylvania, in the Scranton area, and we have world-class speakers who come to it, and we have people from across the country, and sometimes outside the country, attend as well.
Wonderful.
They can get any information they want. Of course, I am on Facebook, but the best thing to do is just shoot us an email at info@hermeticinstitute.org or Google Institute for Hermetic Studies. You'll see my picture or some other pictures there on our webpage, and there's an email address that you can send to. But what we really do encourage you to do is to go to, I think it's, our blog, Vox Hermes, and to subscribe to that. But if people email me, we'll send them the link, and just subscribe, and then you won't miss any announcement.
Thank you. And aside from purchasing the books, is there another way people could support the Institute if they wished?
Oh, sure. Of course, we're always open to your donations. That's how we get these things done. We have a lot of very generous, I mean extremely generous people who helped make these classes available over the years. Those publications that came out of spoken seminars that were part of the audio programs, these are not commercially viable entities by any stretch. And they were only able to come about because of the generous financial support of patrons. So if someone wants to make an annual donation, a weekly donation or monthly or just a one-off, they can contact me and I'll send them a link where they'll be able to do that.
Great.
That's what they can do. And of course, buy the books too and give them to your friends and family. Give them to your lodge library. Even your local library. Something like Egregores or some of the others that we have would be very popular, be useful to others.
That's a good idea. And I'm just wondering if you had any final thoughts for people listening. I know we've talked a lot about your book and your thoughts on the subject, but if there's anything else that you wish to leave people with, by all means.
When you undertake the spiritual path, first and foremost, make it about understanding the nature of your own mind. And that's it. And when you go from there, realize that the more you understand yourself, we'll call that, self-awareness or self-realization. And with that awareness, you can then act. You can bring it into the world, and that's self-actualization. So that's really what to focus on. Don't be concerned with big utopian visions. Don't be concerned with saving the world or being a celebrity of an occult celebrity of some kind or any of that. Just find something in life that you like to do, that you love to do. And through that, know, understand, express yourself, and be helpful to others. Because everything that we do is a helping profession when others need it. Now, some people like to think, I don't like, I hear this all the time from folks, they want their horoscopes done because they want to change their life. So what are you doing? I want to be in a helping profession. So what do you mean? I want to be a nurse, a doctor, a teacher, a social worker? Because that's how those are labeled. So you know what a helping profession is to me? It's my mechanic when I need my something done to my car. Helping profession is a plumber when you need something done to your plumbing. So remember that everything we do has the potential to be helpful to others and a vehicle of our expression, of our knowledge, of ourself, and our relationship to life. That's what this is really about. This is about the energies of life.
Well, Mark, it's really been a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today.